Hello, and welcome to Trip the Beltway Fantastic. At the end of February, newly minted Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth fired his chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, General C.Q. Brown, who was an appointee of the Biden administration and had been on the job for 15 months. Hegseth said Brown, a career Air Force officer, was honorable, but not the right man for the job, and said the replacements of 5 other 3 and 4 stars were a, quote, reflection of the president wanting the right people around him to execute the national security approach we want to take. Among the myriad complaints about these firings is that Trump is not replacing these posts with the most qualified officers, but loyalists. This seems to be the complaint about Trump's choice last week to nominate Lieutenant General Razin Caine to replace Brown as his pick to be chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which writers at military.com called, quote, uncharted territory for the military. They say Caine, a retired 3-star Air Force general, does not meet the legal requirements to serve as the chairman because he never served as the vice chairman, the head of a service branch, or the commander of a unified or specified combatant command. His most recent assignment before retiring in 2024 was the director of special programs in the Department of Defense Special Access Program at the central office in the Pentagon. The other complaint is that Trump and Hegseth have been vocal and active about dismantling the diversity and inclusion programs in the military, and not only had Brown been cited for engaging a quota system in its officer application pool at the Air Force, the military refers to them as goals, not quotas, in 2022, but Trump's advisors also cited a video that Brown made in the wake of the George Floyd death and protests as politicization, and what ultimately blew up his relationships with Brown, as well as then Chairman Mark Milley. Hegseth is also being criticized for firing all the judge advocate generals, also known as the JAGs, the top military lawyers. Some say he wants pliancy rather than experts who can keep the military acting within the rule of law. One of Hegseth's big gripes is that the U.S. lost the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq because their hands were tied due to overly stringent rules of engagement. On Friday, it was announced that he will be repealing restrictions on U.S. airstrikes, broadening the range of people who can be targeted in attacks, and no longer solely focusing on striking senior leadership of terrorist organizations as permitted under the Biden and Obama administrations. This is a lot to unpack. On one hand, we have complaints for years that the military brass is too top-heavy, that the promotional system is broken and corruptive and does not reward strategic competence and critical thinking, rather than people who can maneuver up the food chain with political skill and high deference to doctrine and orthodoxy. But what do we make of Hegseth's moves here? Is he recognizing the real problem, or is he firing these officers for completely different reasons, or a little bit of both? So we brought in our friend of the show, retired Lieutenant Colonel Danny Davis, host and producer of the Deep Dive podcast, to break it all down for us. Thanks, Danny, for joining us on the show again.
Really grateful to be here.
Yeah, I'm so glad to see your face and hear your voice, and looking forward to talking about this. These are issues that you and I have been discussing for some time.
Yeah.
So they're not new. They're just in a new context of the Trump administration and the newly installed Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth. So can you talk a little bit, what was your gut reaction to the CQ Brown firing, as well as the other officers and the JAGs?
Yeah, I don't know much about him personally, only what I've seen in some of the newscasts and that kind of thing. But I am a big proponent, and actually I wrote in, I think it was April 2013, that the Pentagon needed to have a significant culling of a lot of the senior officers, because the system replicates itself. The leaders who are at the top always prevent anyone from coming up who's not like them, who they can't control, etc. And so it's just this status quo stagnation, and we don't ever get any good leaders. People, and obviously the way the Afghanistan withdrawal was handled deserves special scrutiny. But as I was arguing before that happened, it's the people who failed all the way through at recognizing what was going on, at admitting what was going on, lying about what was going on, always got promoted. So that's the people you had at the top of the class. So I argued when Secretary Hegseth was announced as the nominee, I said, if he genuinely wants to reform the military, he is going to have to do what George Marshall did in 1938, 39, where they got rid of what they called dead wood. A lot of the old guard who had been hung over from the World War I, whose mind was still in the old ways and didn't want to recognize the new stuff. And the President FDR at the time said, hey, we need a clean house on this deal and make sure that we got people who can fight modern wars, etc. I said, that's what Hegseth needs. If they want to reform anything, they have got to get a lot of these people out. This is not politicization. At least it shouldn't be. Now, I can't say anything for what Secretary Hegseth is going to do. I have no earthly idea. I don't have any context in there. But at least categorically, I like what he's saying. And fundamentally, it needs to go a lot more than just 5. Because you got to understand, because these guys replicate themselves, they insulate everybody at the top so that they do what the old people is, and they definitely don't want change. They love things. They want to tinker around the edges. They want to change a little bit here, definitely add some money over there, but they don't want to change anything. And if Hegseth does, they will resist that. So he's going to have to clean house and make sure that the people there aren't just loyal, but that they're highly qualified. And there are plenty of people who are very qualified, but that aren't standard data people from the establishment. And if he can get that done, then he's got a real chance at doing something good.
I mean, I've been around you and others who have really broken down this argument about the promotional system and how things operate in this ecosystem. And I understand the issue of this top-heavy officer class and the status quo that it maintains, and how it's become so counterproductive to our foreign policy and our military strategy. But can you describe for listeners who may not be up to speed on this issue, what's the difference between, say, a lieutenant colonel who leaves the military, and some colonels who leave the military and feel very emboldened to talk about what the problems are here, and be very frank in their criticisms of the military culture and what's wrong with it, and then everybody else up at the top who seem to be living in some la la land, and they're very deferential to the institution. Can you talk about why there's this break? At what point did these guys get?
And I think I can use, certainly I know somebody that you know and respect well, Doug McGregor is the greatest example of that, because while he was in uniform, he wrote the book Breaking the Phalanx that showed in 1997 how we need to reorganize the Department of Defense, how we need to do things to be able to fight wars of the future, et cetera. And had his vision been in place the way he drew it up in the 90s, then we would already be way ahead of what the Russian army is right now, because many of the things he foresaw in the 90s have played out on the ground in warfare between the Russians and the Ukraine. Unfortunately, our military is not. We're way, way, way behind what the Russians. If we had to fight an unexpected war against the Russians, that I pray to God we never do, but if we do right now, we are so far behind the power curve. I fear that we could literally lose battles, and God forbid, even a war with Russia, if we had to fight right now, because our experience level and our formations, our organization, our mentality, the way we think is just off the charts behind what they were doing. Because Doug talked about those things while he was still on active duty, he was clear that he didn't want to just tinker around the edges. He was talking about something that was going to be a major changes. Now, Doug, up to that point, I think he was a full colonel. He had already, gotten a Bronze Star Medal for valor because of his actions at the Battle of 7-3 Easting, and he was brilliant. I was right behind him, physically behind him on the battlefield, saw what he did in combat, and he should have been at the top of any list to get higher command. He then went on to command a cavalry squadron, and in peacetime, and just was off the charts successful, even at the national training centers where others usually would fail early and then they get better. He started great and won from the beginning. By every right, in any kind of military organization based on merit, he would have immediately been given brigade command and then on up the list because of his qualifications. But because he didn't want to tinker around the edges, he couldn't be trusted and to keep things the steady state. So he
Right.
never got promoted, or he got colonel, but he was never given a brigade command, even though he outshined everyone else. That's what the system does. If guys who can't be controlled, the guys who can't do what the system says they should do, don't get promoted up, because these guys who were in the system decide who gets to come up from the bottom. That's how the system is designed. So it keeps guys like McGregor or these other like lieutenant colonels you're talking about, because they can't be trusted to keep the status quo going on. All the ones who get up here can.
Ugh. And this has been going on for some time. Do you think this contributed to our failures in Iraq and Afghanistan?
100%, without any question, it did. That's why in 2013 I wrote that article and I wasn't the first one to do it. There was some others that had been writing even before that recognized a lot of this rot at the top, the mental rot, because they just want the status quo to be maintained, and they make all these videos sometimes that show all this future modernistic stuff that they're going to produce, and and they have these big PowerPoint briefings and they look good. They have medals all over their chest every time they come before Congress. The American people think every general is today like George Patton or something like that, and they have this deference because they don't know any difference.
Right.
And it seems rational. I mean, you don't get that high unless you're really good. It just seems logical, and it should be that way, but they don't know how the inner workings happen behind the scenes, and the people that don't get promoted who have the merit, because they want to break things to build things up, as opposed to, no, let's just protect what we have. And because of that, now then you have people that come up, they see people above them lying. They see them say, no, things are going well. We're winning here. The Afghan security forces are improving by the day. They're getting the confidence of their people. The government is becoming less and less corrupt, etc. The Iraqi security forces, they're really doing good now. They're taking over the fight. All this stuff, they knew it wasn't true. Nobody who was on the ground there could ever have believed that, yet they said it. And these guys get promoted to the next star and the next star all the way up the top. So they see that to get promoted and to play the line is very, very beneficial to your career. And of course, then you go in and out of government, you go into these think tanks, you go into these defense contractors, these boards, etc. And it's very, very lucrative. And if you're telling the truth, impacts your ability to make money, most people do what it takes to get the money.
If you had your druthers, what's the first thing that you would reform? Is it the promotional system in itself? Like, how can you explain to a civilian like me how that works and how it could be fixed?
Well, it's you can't do one thing first. It's got to be a systemic change. You've got to say, all right, we're going to change things. Now, again, at least on the surface, Secretary Hegseth seems to be on this track, because he said he wants to reform the military. He wants to rebuild the forces, and for another R, I think he has something to increase our ability to deter fight, so we don't have to fight. But if we do, that we decisively win. Fantastic concept. If that's what he actually employs, then we're going to be in really good shape. But that means you're going to have to reform how generals are promoted. You're going to have to, you can't do anything else. You've got to clean house at the top first. In my view, that's got to be first. There's other things to do simultaneously, but if you don't get rid of the people at the top, they will never accept people coming in underneath. They won't be part of change. You've got to clear the decks, bring a new crop up that believe the same things that you do, that are willing to get behind it, that are qualified. Then you can go about putting change in the promotion system, and then you can go about looking at meritocracy and what are the standards for that, et cetera. A lot of things that would go into that, but that is first and foremost, and without that, you just can't succeed.
Now, what about the whole issue of military culture, specifically diversity and inclusion programs? I mean, Hegseth wrote an entire book about how this was corrupting or eating away at the war fighter ethos of the military, all of these DEI programs, quota systems that are masked as
Yeah.
what do you call them, goals of the
Goals.
forces.
Yeah,
Is this
the
a
four-star general
distraction?
says, "This is a goal. It's not a requirement." Yeah,
Right.
everybody knows what that means. It's an order, you know? Yeah, listen, you don't when I was I especially remember when I was, younger in my career, when I was, enlisted actually in the '80s, late '80s, and then I became an officer in the early '90s, and I remember thinking that I was so grateful because the U.S. Army, especially at that time, that it was, I mean, it's almost trite to say it, but colorblind. We didn't care anything about your ethnicity or anything else. We cared about whether you did your job that good. And because it's a mosaic of the, whole country, there was every demographic you can imagine in there. No one cared about any of that. They only cared what you did on the field of performance. And I thought it was really cool that I personally, maybe I'm sure that were some because people are involved. I never saw any racism at all. I saw issues between individuals that didn't like each other, maybe, and it didn't matter whether they were the same color or different color or ethnicity or religion, whatever. But it was a really good system because that was the command climate at the top. It said, we don't care about your characteristics. We care about one green uniform and you performing according to this one standard. Everybody loved that. Everybody did good to that. Then all of a sudden we need to, whatever, people start thinking, well, we need to start changing that and forcing this category into that, whatever. And it created a lot of animosity. And this last administration, doesn't matter what anybody wants to claim. You just look at the numbers that people were not joining the military. People who got out of the military were not recommending it for the people coming in because they were tired of these pointless deployments all over the place, fighting for something that had nothing to do with American national security and all of these, whether you want to call them goals or criteria or whatever else. It was clear that that was the case. You could see it graphically portrayed there, and everybody knew it was not anymore exclusively about your merit and your capacity. And you saw that play out in the recruiting. It was going down, 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 and we couldn't make the numbers. We kept lowering the standards. We still didn't make it, etc. Now President Trump comes in, and at least the last full data I saw was in December, where it was at a 14-year high, because people see that the culture has changed, that the top has changed. And if Hegseth carries through and actually does what he said he's going to do, I bet those numbers are going to continue to rise, because now then they can see, okay, now then the standard matters. Now then there's categories don't matter. And listen, when getting rid of DEI stuff, you don't want to get rid of fairness and equality.
Right.
That,
Right. Right.
you still want to say, all right, we're not going to elevate now this category of people because now then this one is no longer in favor. I don't want to elevate any category other than capacity and what you do and how you perform. And if Secretary Hegseth sticks with that, I think we have a real chance to turn things around.
Let me ask you a question. I know one of the complaints on the other side is it's not that there isn't a lot of there aren't a lot of minorities in the enlisted ranks, but they're not seeing them reflected in the officer ranks. Is there any way in which Hispanics, Blacks, other ethnicities can be encouraged, I guess, from the beginning into a officer training, and so that they will be equipped and qualified for that position when it gets to that point, without establishing all of these goals or quotas? Like, I understand the need to see the commanders reflecting the demography in the ranks, but without, I guess, creating special categories, which
Yeah.
obviously don't leave anybody very satisfied.
Yeah, I think it's real important to look at all of the factors that go into that. If you find, because you do a thorough data analysis, and if you find that, and we'll just pick Blacks for a minute. If you see that there's, and I don't know what the numbers are, X% of Blacks is lieutenants and captains, and then X minus some other percent in the major lieutenant colonel, and then X minus another percent at the higher levels, then and then you look at, this is important, then you look at the criteria of the selections in each of these categories going forward. If you see a lower percentage of the Black officers being elevated to other colors, white or Hispanic, anything else, then you may say, hey, we may have a problem here. Because if a Black candidate and all the other ones come aboard and somehow the system goes, yeah, I'm not so keen on the black one, so I'm not going to promote as many of those, then there's a problem that needs to be fixed. But if an analysis of the data says, no, they're not selected any more or less than any other category, there's just fewer of them that want to stay in. Maybe they get out as captains and majors. Maybe they go somewhere else. Then maybe there's no problem at all. That's just individual preference. And, they'll go wherever they want to go. The issue being, you have to make sure, and you do have to investigate, is there, even if it's not because of any quotas or anything else, but because they're being unfairly kept down, then that needs to be addressed and changed.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if I have the confidence in the military to actually do the hard work that you just described and do it fairly, but I'm hoping, because I really do think that this is the way that this issue gets hyper politicized, is when you talk about race. And so the takeaway for all of the non-Trump or the anti-Trump folks are, he's a racist, and he wants to maintain an all-white military. And he gets Hegseth on board to talk about DEI and getting rid of that, and that's how he's going to do it. When, as you describe, it's a much more complicated issue than that. And it is also a much broader issue, because we're talking about reform that is necessary, that goes way beyond just race, but goes into the promotional system that has just absolutely maintained a system in which the worst people are getting elevated to our combatant
irrespective
commands.
Of color or religion. Some of the worst people are getting up there. That's what really needs to get squashed.
Right. So, well, listen, I know we don't have any time left, and I'm just so gracious for you to come on the show and talk about all these issues, and please come back.
Look forward to it. Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you.